name is Mary Jane Burke. I'm the Marin County Superintendent of Schools. I welcome you here. Welcome to everyone. Very happy to introduce you ever so briefly to our speakers. And so let me first just make a couple of comments. One of the challenges, of course, for all of us is that we know before we even start this presentation that education is not adequately funded. So let's just start there. And then do also know that as we look to the challenges in our community, there are many. Because what we want to make sure is that we're providing kids the education that we would want for our own. And that means the most amazing, well-rounded education that will ensure that all kids get what they need to succeed, not really in school, even though we want them to do well in school, but rather to make sure they do well in life. So know that at this point, there's still a lot of unknowns related to the budget and what the implications will be, but there is something that is absolutely known. Education is not adequately funded, and I'll give you one example that could resonate for our community in particular. If you imagine special education, and you know that we have over 4,000 kids in this community who need more to get the same opportunities from a special ed viewpoint, the funding for special ed has been inadequate for many, many years, back to 1978 when the law essentially said that we need to make sure that kids with special needs are served well. And the federal government said that they would support special ed by 40%, right? They would fund that, and the fact is that that has not happened. It has never happened. Currently, it's at about 8%. What that means in Marin County, so across these districts, is that there is approximately $62 million that comes out of the general fund of the school districts in this community because of the lack of funding for special ed. And if you then take all of the parcel taxes countywide, so every parcel tax, and put them together, and as you know, most of our districts, except Sausalito, Marin City, and 2 rurals, have parcel taxes in place. That number is all that represents $50 million. So if you can put that in perspective, right, about what that means and why there are so many challenges, you know why you're here today and why this is something we need to work on, not just in Marin, but across the state. So with that table that I've set, right, I'm going to start by introducing you to Mike Fine. Mike? Okay, let's hear it for Mike Fine.
We won't clap when I'm done.
Exactly. Mike is the Chief Executive Officer of the Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team. He served as the Chief Administrative Officer for FICMAT. Prior to joining FICMAT, he has had a long career in education finance, Director of Fiscal Services for Newport Mesa, Assistant Superintendent for the Riverside USD in 2002, Deputy Superintendent of Business and Governmental Relations for 13 years, numerous awards, including the Riverside County Classified Educator Award of the Year. Mike has brought to FICMAT a sense of clarity combined with compassion and courageous leadership, and for that we're very grateful. Next, Brooks Allen. Brooks Allen has made a name for himself as a skilled attorney and a strong advocate for equitable education. He served as Director of Education Advocacy for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and many of you, in fact, all of you probably in this room are well aware of the Williams lawsuit and the reports that our boards go through several times a year. He was the attorney that led that effort with the ACLU, and for that we can be thankful that we have sufficient textbooks, safe and clean school facilities, etc. And at that time, I happened to be the president of of the county superintendent's organization. And so it was at that moment that I met Brooks, worked with Brooks, and knew someday I wanted him to be a part of the team here at the county office. He was Deputy Policy Director and Legal Advisor to the State Board of Education, instrumental in the development of the local control funding formula, graduate of Stanford and Yale Law School and MCOE, and Marin County is very fortunate to have him here. He's the liaison with the CCEE, the California Collaborative for Excellence in Education, and serves as one of our own. So thank you very much, Brooks. Let's hear it.
Well, good afternoon. My pleasure to be here, I think. A little hard when Mary Jane calls, right? You can't really say no. So, but it's absolutely my pleasure to be with you guys this afternoon. We have probably one of the simplest state budgets in years. It is what we kind of in Sacramento would refer to as a workload budget. It really just maintains what we have. The word maintain, though, in this case is probably a little bit of a word of art because I can almost assure you that to do everything you're doing today, next year with this budget you won't have enough money to do that. While it's a very healthy cost of living adjustment that we're going to see in a minute, by the time you factor other things in, your costs are going to go up more than the COLA is going to fund. But it is what we would refer to as a workload budget. The new governor certainly has his imprint on the budget. This is not a take office and be sworn in on Monday and release a budget on Thursday and have only a couple days of influence. Over the budget, the presumption, of course, was he was going to be governor for some time even before early November, and he's had a team in place working with the existing team. This is also a transfer from one Democratic administration to another Democratic administration. Many of the same players are still in their seats and functioning on a regular basis, and so the governor certainly has been able to have his imprint on the original budget and going forward. And for those of you that don't think he's a detail person, if you watched his news conference, press conference on the release of the budget, he spent nearly 2 hours at the podium and he answered all the questions himself. Our former governor would have spent 10 to 15 minutes getting the major points across, and then the minute there was a detailed question turned to Michael Cohen, his director of finance, and said, you know, Michael, would you come up to the podium and answer? That's not what happened with this governor. He had an absolute command of the details. That's not something you do in 4 days, right? It's something you've spent months working on and thinking about and influencing. And I would repeat that same thing in a meeting maybe a week later on a Friday afternoon in the midst of a strike in a district down south. While he brought staff members together to brief him, I don't think they got one say. They didn't even open their mouth once. He basically kind of laid out, this is what's going on, and a complete command of the information both from the district and from the association and the dynamics of how all that's coming together. Had a very thorough understanding of the facts. And so I think, you know, when you go through a budget, when you go through some of those activities, you start to see a person in a different role, right? And start to see some of those attributes and start to understand where they're at. So Brooks and I are going to share this presentation, relatively quick presentation. We're going to start with the budget, and then I've thrown a couple other things in that I think are probably of interest, as has Brooks, but really this is your time. So make sure you ask questions. Don't let something go by. If you've got a question, just interrupt and ask. And we'll certainly have time at the end to go through some things. So K-12 at a glance. Number one, we believe that the revenue assumptions, which are the most important here in a state budget at this point, are absolutely reasonable assumptions. This isn't a situation where we went from a very fiscally conservative administration that didn't push the envelope on revenue forecasts, let them fall, see what happens, and then deal with them a year later. to an administration that pushed that envelope and said we can be a little bit more assertive and aggressive. That wasn't the case here. What's here is very assertive. And by the way, your office are sending these out to the attendees, the slides out to the attendees, so you'll get these when we're done. And so that's an important piece, I think. There, some risk of a new administration coming in saying, I want to do this, this, and this, and there have been constraint on that for the last 8 years, given the state's fiscal condition. That's not what we have here. Governor Newsom has kind of picked up where Governor Brown left off with regard to approach to revenue forecast and so on. I'm going to cover in some detail the rest of the items except for the very last one. I think it's important that you know there is no per ADA one-time funds in this budget proposal. So each of the last 6 years, in fact over the last 6 years we've had almost $7 billion with a B of one-time funds, a little each year, come through school districts. And that was because Governor Brown's approach was to be fairly conservative on the revenues, and if they materialized in a given year, then the next year he basically went back and made good on those under Proposition 98 and paid those out to school districts, but he treated them in each case as one-time money to always provide a safety net, if you will, should the economy begin to tank. There are no per ADA one-time dollars going forward, and that isn't 100% driven by a new administration. That's more probably 99% driven by simply the facts of revenue growth in the state, Proposition 98, how it's calculated, what was allocated out this year, and so on. We've actually expected the Prop 98 and the revenue forecast to be coming together leading up to this. I think it would be safe to say if Jerry Brown were still in office releasing this budget, that same would be true for this coming year at this point in time. The numbers just simply don't lend themselves to any kind of Prop 98 catch-up from last year. We are fully apportioned. In fact, you're going to see on the next slide that we actually have taken a mid-year cut this year. You just haven't felt it. So, already spoken to the revenues. The revenues statewide are up by about $8 billion. This is over a 3-year period. And one of the reasons we feel pretty confident with these numbers is that one of the years is already passed. 17-18's already passed. See, the state, it continues to account for revenues for almost a decade. All of us in our local districts, we close the books and we're done with that year. Right? The state keeps their books open basically. Whatever comes in late and all this stuff, they attribute it back to the proper year because there are so many formulas, Prop 98 being a big one, that you calculate on an annual basis. And it has part of this year in it, so we already have 6 months of actuals in this year. So for half of this 3-year period, we know the number, right? We're only left then with the last 6 months of this year and next year that the $8 billion is driven by a forecast, which is what brings some credibility and some surety to around that number. The governor certainly raises the same concerns that Governor Brown had raised over and over again about the economy. And in fact, we have some estimates of what a mild recession would do to Proposition 98, a mild recession being 24 months only, and hitting us next year, hitting us in 20. So part, at the very end of next year, would have almost a $10 billion impact. We have a rainy day fund at the end of this year in the $13 billion, and rainy day fund under the current budget estimated to grow to $15 billion at the end of next year, so June of 20. And so you can see that at $10 billion a year impact from a recession, we'd have sufficient rainy day funds, if you will, to get us through 1 year, but not 2 years. And they were defining a mild recession as 2 years. I don't know that we've seen a mild recession only last 2 years in a very long time. So just understand there's some risk here, obviously, depending on what happens. So Prop 98, as a result, grows by just under $3 billion, $2.8 billion. $2 billion of that, by the way, that's an identical number that the legislative analysts came out with in November. So Department of Finance and the LAO are often at this point in the year not on the same page, often very, very close, but in this particular case, right down to the dollar, they are together. $2 billion of that goes into cost of living adjustments that we'll explore in just a second in some detail, with a very healthy COLA of 3.46. Now remember, the COLA at this point in the year, well, I'll save my COLA comment until we get to the COLA page. That is net of an almost $400 million negative adjustment. And that's what I meant. We took a mid-year cut this year, but we haven't felt it. We don't really feel it till next year. In this past year was the second year in a row, consecutive year, that statewide ADA is in a decline. And when you reach that second consecutive year, Prop 98, for all intents, gets rebenched. Probably state doesn't call it rebenching at that point, but it gets adjusted. And so that includes that. We should have seen that last June in the state budget that was adopted for this year. Department of Finance simply addressed it by saying we had a workload issue and we didn't do the calculation in the spring. And so we're seeing it basically a year later accounted for. So that growth in Prop 98 includes that negative adjustment. We'll get to the COLA pieces later. The $9 million, I'm sorry, we'll address that. The 576 is special ed. We'll also address in more detail in just a second to the extent that we have details. We do have, as of Friday afternoon, budget trailer bill language around this. Probably half of the room are not going to appreciate what the budget trailer bill language says, but we'll talk about that in a second. $20 million to county offices to increase their work on differentiated assistance. This isn't necessarily additional work, but the fact that we've grown, I'm not going to get the numbers right, from 200 and, is it 390? We've grown from 280, was it 286 districts across the state that qualify for differentiated assistance to this year 390. And so it's just additional districts that drive the additional funding. The $4 million, presumably one time, however, we were just talking about this. I think the money they're putting, this $4 million they're putting is from a one-time source. However, the nature of this is meant to be ongoing for 5 years. And so it may be 5 years of one-time money, not sure the language around it and the source of funds, which is why I have the parenthetical comment here because it wasn't clear, but we were just talking about it this afternoon. Go to 8 county offices to support building capacity around services that we now know of as differentiated assistance in districts. The bottom line is it's meant to be ongoing. Even with ongoing commitments, the state often says, we've got these one-time sources, we'll put them in for this year, we'll figure out the ongoing nature next year. They may take some other one-time. I have a whole division of FCMAT that has been funded for 25 years, I think, with one-time money every year. And so I understand what they're doing. It makes folks like me that are managing 70 people in that division a little nervous, right, when the funding source is always one time, but it pops up every year as, you know, just a little different tone of green on the dollar bill. So cost of living adjustment, the 3.46 is applied across the board to LCFF, to categoricals such as AB 602, which is special ed money, and to county offices. And this is important because we don't always have the same COLA applied in all these categories. In fact, last year, or the year we're in right now, the 3.71 COLA is not applied that same way. 3.71, the COLA is actually 2.71, and the legislature upped it to whatever you want to call it. We call it a super COLA, but we don't do that too often in public, so I can keep my mouth shut. But we talk about, or that extra 1% only went to K-12. It didn't go, or only went to school districts. It didn't include county offices on it. So this 3.46 is applied. Know that 3.46 is an estimate. It is a calculation that we don't know until April, which is why we have a May revised budget. Is the main thing in the May revised is setting the COLA. It's a national number that is the implicit price deflator for government goods and services for the 12-month period ending March 30th. And so that's why we know it in November. We still have, when this was estimated, we still had a quarter left of activity. And yes, in the midst of that quarter, we've had an extended federal government shutdown, which actually could drop that number. The question is now that all elements of the government are back open, will they catch up on their spending? So not their employees, but this is purchases. So will they catch up on their, however, we're on the 4th, so the 10 days left we have before we get shut down again, right? Or the threat of being shut down again. The question is, will they have caught up on buying goods and services in that time period? Because otherwise it could have a negative impact on this fourth quarter calculation. It is a higher estimate than what the Department of Finance came out with last June, which was 2.57, and it's a higher estimate than the LAO's November forecast of 3.1. So both of those are very good. All of your districts, you should see as a result of this budget either an adjustment up from 2.57, which is candidly where I would expect the adjustment to be from. However, some of your districts may have gotten a little aggressive at first interim and used the LAO's November forecast, and had they, no real criticism, that's probably not the best practice, but no real criticism, the adjustment may be up from 3.1. So each of your districts may have approached it slightly different. Okay? Special ed. Also gets the COLA, as I mentioned. There's an additional $390 million of recurring and $186 million of one-time funds. I gave you the quotes out of what we call the A pages, which are just the budget summary that comes out on the 10th of January. We were waiting on the trailer bill language by February 1st. It did come out on Friday. So there's a page and a half of how this is calculated. There is probably no clarity in the language, except a page and a half of calculations. But it follows, for all intents and purposes, follows concentration grants. So if your district receives a concentration grant, it would share in this. If you don't receive a concentration grant, it would appear that you don't share in this money. And they do break out the 390 from the 186, but they apply the exact same formula to both buckets. Is that fair? Unduplicated count. Unduplicated count. I said concentration grant. Unduplicated count. So both supplemental and concentration. Yeah, sorry, that's my...
It's only for the 186.
The 186 is slightly different where it's only the concentration grant, right? So it appears to be building a ratio between your students with special needs and total enrollment, including where you stand in relationship to the state as a whole, and then applying an unduplicated count factor to it as well. Appears to be the formula. More important maybe than the formula is clarity around the language. And so there are 4 provisions in there, and I didn't memorize them in the time. I can pull them up on my phone. Oh, you got it in handwriting. But it does appear that a couple of the provisions are for, well, number one, the first provision is for early ed, which is consistent with the governor's priority. You're all providing mandated early ed services and special ed right now, but you receive basically no funding for it. There's very little federal funding and no state funding for early ed, special ed. So it does provide that, which will be a help to you all financially. Item 2 is one-time programs and resources for students with exceptional needs that are not medically or educationally necessary, therefore not in their IEPs. So services above their IEPs. Strategies to improve student outcomes identified through the statewide system of support. So if you're in differentiated assistance as a result of special ed, which is the majority of districts across the state. And then wraparound services for students with special needs. So mental health, regular counseling, maybe some additional medical services. So you may already be providing some of those, maybe language acquisition services with respect to English learners. You may already be providing some of those services, and therefore you'll receive the funds without a need to provide additional. And the fifth area is professional development activities and the coordination of services with other agencies, programs, and resources.
Are these going to go to basic aid districts?
AB 602 flows to basic aid districts. Well, okay. This is not AB 602 money, doesn't follow the 602 formula.
It's not Prop 98.
It is Prop 98. Well, let's see. I can tell you this, it does not carve out community-funded districts.
But if it doesn't flow through,
It doesn't flow, it follows the principles of LCFF, but doesn't flow through. Thank you, Tarina. I think that's the easiest way to say it. It follows the principles of the unduplicated count and the concentration related to that and so on, but it doesn't flow through LCFF. So I think the simple answer would be yes, it flows to community-funded districts. Good point. Good question.
And just with a quick caveat, going back to what Mike said earlier, which is, this is a proposal, right? It's a proposal where the language came out Friday. So it's just the first attempt, and the formula and the tweaking will probably continue, certainly up to May, and then even after May into the actual adoption.
So know that O'Donnell's bill last year, and it's been reintroduced this year to bring about equalization in special ed funding across districts. That bill is, the price tag on that proposal is about 1.2, I think. I may be off just a tad, around $1.2 billion. So 576 million gets you just less than halfway. That will be where the debate's at. Should this money just be put into that equalization process, but it won't achieve it all, or would the money be in what the administration has laid out as a proposal? Right, that'll be the legislative debate. But you can start to get a sense, and only 390 of it's recurring, and equalization, to do equalization right, it has to be recurring, right? And in that case, that would flow through AB 602, which a community-funded district receives. So STRS relief. This is a pleasant surprise, I think, for most. I said this to the media when the budget came out, probably more important than the dollars is that somebody in Sacramento is acknowledging the pressure point, right? However, I think it's also important to know that this is a problem we all have to take ownership of. The state is not going to solve the STRS and PERS funding issue. They handed it to us several years ago, and we're going to solve it. They have come along this past year with that extra 1% COLA, while publicly they certainly would not tie that. There was a clear understanding of the legislature they needed to do something, and they elected to do that with an extra little bump in the COLA. But this year the governor has specifically proposed transferring some non-Proposition 98 money, which should cause, which everybody should applaud, everybody in this room should applaud, right, from an education standpoint. However, that is also what assigns risk to this proposal, okay? And it's under the governor's theory of paying down debt. This $3 billion is part of a $9 billion proposal, $8.9 billion proposal to pay down debt. $3 billion to STRS on behalf of us as school employers, $2.9 billion to STRS on behalf of the state's liability to STRS, because the state does share in the STRS liability, and another $3 billion to PERS on behalf of the state as an employer. So the first thing you all need to understand is there's no relief on PERS for school employers. The contribution the governor has proposed to PERS is the state as an employer. Remember, the state is the largest employer in PERS. All state employees are in PERS, right? And the school, unlike STRS, which is one retirement pool, in PERS there's a separate school pool within PERS from municipal governments and state government and so on. And so this is a contribution on behalf of the state. There's also important to break out the detail here. So there's two major components to this proposal by the governor. The first is $700 million, which is made up of $350 million for this coming year and $350 million for 2021. And that $350 million is identified as what it would take to buy down the rate increase by 1%. The rate for STRS is, the employer rate is still going up between this year and next year. It just won't go up as much. It will go up 1% less than what it was forecasted to go up, okay? Or 1 percentage point less in both of those years. I think most of us believe that this is probably pretty risk-free. Number one, it's a payment to STRS that actually equals the 1% calculation. So it's not like a payment to STRS, and STRS has to invest it and get a certain rate of earnings on it to be able to get to 1% buy down, right? It's a flat payment that is equivalent to buying the rate down by 1%. There's nothing STRS has to do with, yes, they have to put the money in the pool and continue to earn, have earnings on it, but they don't have to have the earnings by the time it has an impact on us, if that makes any sense, okay? The 2.3 billion is a little different animal. It is paid also this coming year, but STRS, the intent here is to get about 6 billion out of it of long-term rate buy down that would be equivalent to 0.5 percentage point. That one's far more at risk, and does it really equate to the 0.5 percentage point or not? Depends on a million variables, including investment earnings. And PERS actually had negative investment earnings STRS had negative investment earnings last year. And so does the 2.3 have the long-term impact the governor's looking for or not? That's a little bit of a wait and see. So there's definitely more risk assigned to the 2.3 and the long-term half. So what you have to know is in your school districts is these two pieces related to the 700 million are basically one-time in nature, right? At 1% each year, ultimately, even under the governor's proposal, 1% becomes 0.5 on an ongoing basis. So at least part of it's one-time and part of it's recurring from the governor's proposal standpoint. However, if this piece of it has risk and STRS can't perform as forecasted here, then it has a higher level of risk associated to it. I think that's the easiest way to say it. I have not visited with STRS yet. That will be Friday to understand how they're calculating this, and that will give a little bit better clue of what risks are assigned and kind of how they're thinking they're going to go about this. That understanding will help us kind of determine that level of risk and how much of this that we can advise districts to count at this point in the year and not. 1% is certainly not going to save the day in your budgets, but it's nothing to sneeze at either. Give you an order of magnitude in LA Unified. I know these numbers by heart, given the activities there. In LA Unified, that 1% is $24 million. So just understand that for them, they're now dealing, after their settlement, with a $1 billion issue. So that 1% helps by $24 million, okay? Just to put it all in perspective, okay? You too, there's an open seat on the LA board for you to and put up with that nonsense. You too can share in their excitement. Facilities funding. Important for any of you that are in line with Prop 51 projects and you've been waiting. Certainly Governor Brown was intentionally slow in the amount of money that was released under Prop 51. Number one, he didn't want to incur the debt associated to it. And number two is staff constantly said we could only process so much per year. So this is clearly a stamp of the new governor on this. They're almost doubling the amount of Prop 51 money that will be allocated out next year. They also are adding 10 positions to the Office of Public School Construction to process the applications. But you're going to see in another slide in just a second, by mid-year, they will be completely out of Prop 51 money. So you can rejoice in the speed up, but just know if you already don't, well, even if you have an application there, if you're fairly low on the list, speeding up the processing isn't going to do you any good, okay? And so, but this is certainly an imprint from Governor Newsom. Full day kindergarten. How many of you in the room do not have full day kindergarten? Okay, and if you mind sharing if it's facilities are the hurdle to do that, or is it another reason, such as teacher contract, philosophical issues with younger kids in a full day?
Both.
Do you-
I think it's both for Nevada.
Including facilities? Or
Some
both
are not.
being, okay, more the other, okay. And there were a couple hands over here willing to share?
Yeah, not facility.
It's not facilities, okay. So, one of the premises of this, the more people I talk to, the more I know I'm right. One of the premises of this is the state says from a survey that I'm not sure is a quality survey to start with, is that 22% of the state's kindergarten classrooms are not full day. And they want to bring that to 0. And this is consistent with the governor's focus around early childhood. We might think about starting whether kindergarten's mandated or not mandated, right? It's still not a mandated grade, which then leads to somebody's question earlier today, does that mean TK is not mandated? And we have, Brooks has a great attorney answer for that. But 22% of the state's kindergarten classrooms are not full day. And they believe that facilities is the overwhelming reason for that. I happen to know one fairly large district in the Central Valley who does not have full day, and it's not a facilities issue. And they probably make up quite a bit of the 22% actually. And so this year, the state allocated $100 million of non-Prop 98 one-time money to modernize or construct new classrooms for kindergarten. So modernizing would basically be get them to kindergarten standards, which is not 960 square feet, it's 1,050 or 1,150, well, I should know that number and I don't, and restrooms, right? And so Governor Newsom proposes an additional $750 million next year under the same basic premise, right? We happen to know from Friday, data was just released, of the $100 million, 72 applications have been received for $121 million. So there is some need to go beyond the $100 million, but let's just assume that every district that facilities was really the hurdle put in their application. It's not worth 750, we need 21 million more, right? And so that's what, again, leads me to believe that their baseline data and premise for this is just off a little bit. I'm just not convinced yet it's all facilities. The other reason that influences this is 65% of the districts across the state are declining enrollment. When you're declining enrollment, you have empty facilities. And so there's just some pieces out there. This money, while it builds upon something the legislature's already familiar with, because it's non-Prop 98, this could be money that's at risk. The non-Prop 98 folks won't like it being spent here. 100 million was probably easier for them to swallow. When you add the two together, we're starting to round at $1 billion. That may be more difficult for them to swallow. So we'll see where this goes. I do think at a minimum the state's got to do a little bit more research on the topic and what the need is and what the driving issue is. So preschool, certainly we know that this is a hot issue for the governor. Real focus here. However, in the first year, there's actually very little money going into this. And there are not some things done that actually would increase preschool opportunities at school districts. Some simple rule changes that wouldn't cost the state any money. We haven't seen those come out yet. They may be in the trailer bill, however, they weren't in any of the budget summaries. So the only impact really here, because this is not, the 125 million is non-Prop 98, this is not preschool slots for at school districts. This is at private providers. And there is some shift going on out of Prop 98, the almost 300 million, again to non-LEAs, non-local educational agencies, so again, private providers. There's really nothing done in the budget that enhances preschool opportunities within school districts themselves, either half-day or full-day programs. Okay? I was going to say, this is not...
Yeah, exactly. So I think we all know that typically there tends to be, at least in Sacramento, there's usually discussion about there's a real firewall between budget and then with policy. policy, that's when we do bills, right? And that's when they go to policy committees and we follow, it literally is like Schoolhouse Rock, you follow the trace of a bill. But the reality is, and I think probably almost everyone in this room has probably experienced this over the years, that especially in education, although more and more across all areas of the budget, you really can't separate the two, and some of the most fundamental policy changes really happen within the course of the budget, which has a different path, and there have been new transparency rules that have gotten built in, some from the voters, to ensure that there is more transparency in the process. But ultimately, when we really try to intuit what is this governor, what's the new governor going to do that's both consistent with what Governor Brown did over his past 8 years, and what's going to be different, really that first glimpse we got is through this budget. As Mike was referring to, he knew it, forwards and backwards, knew all the details. There's no question that it's his, right? And it's coming from this administration. So quickly, kind of borrowing on costs, some of the numbers we've looked at, we wanted to touch on some of the things that we know are the same, and then touch upon some of these areas where he's kind of announced he's going to strike out a different path. Again, we'll have to see where the legislature either meets him and says we agree, or where they may have some disagreements. But one, he really called this budget a California for all budget. And there were a lot of different pieces of that across housing, transportation, and others. But in education, I think it was most marked for really announcing what he had talked about during the campaign. He is really viewing this as, and he uses the term cradle to career. Right? You see some of the investments, we can have some people within the administration have the title with cradle career in their title now. Really when they talk about for all, looking about how is it when we look at K-12, that we're looking all the way back to prenatal, all the way up through college and ultimately into career, and looking for investments and looking for linkages across all of those. And those are some things that really are a change. Governor Brown didn't take the same integrated approach, particularly in K-12, but some of the pieces really are similar. So there was some question, at least just kind of a sense of wonder about what was going to happen with respect to local control funding formula. Were we going to see, for instance, a real return to talking about, hey, that was tried, now we're going to go back to categoricals, right? Maybe not revenue limits, but we see more of that coming out. And already, there's some folks who look and say, hey, wait a second, we see some of these proposals Mike was talking about, they're very specific, right? That starts to sound a little bit like categorical. But if you look fundamentally at the budget, it really does double down on saying, look, we're going to continue to invest in local control funding formula as our main mechanism for distributing K-12 funding across the state. Not only are we doing that, we're doing it with this COLA, which as Mike was referring to is a larger COLA. And then really built into that formula have come some of those really substantial changes we've seen in the structure of what we call, quote unquote, accountability, our state system of support. When we think about things like the California School Dashboard that we've gotten used to talking about now, look at those indicators. What does that mean when we start talking about federal accountability? So we talk about ESSA and how there's the states had this overlay of state ESSA identification. State identifies local educational agencies in need of some support and assistance. ESSA really focuses on schools. The State Board of Education has really emphasized a way to try to merge those two to the full extent possible over the past 8 years. You saw this budget call out very specifically an intent to continue doing that. So for instance, there's a provision that talks about taking the school accountability report cards and merging them with some of the reporting requirements for ESSA. That could have been a Jerry Brown budget provision. It talks about continuing to invest in the state system of support with the County Office of Education, really providing the hub for that support and assistance. Both your local County Office of Education as well as these geographic leads that Mike referred to, special education content leads, process leads, really this whole source of having kind of regional and content areas of expertise around the state that are available to support districts, not so much with the idea that it kind of prevailed under NCLB of kind of naming, shaming, and then ultimately looking for penalties if you didn't reach targets. Again, something you would have seen, the verbiage, everything else, very consistent with what we saw in a Brown budget and a Brown support consistent with the State Board of Ed. The other big questions always talk about these shifts. One of the things that happened with Governor Brown's administration is we started to see, obviously, this embracement of the new content standards, right? We talked about what was Common Core, the California standards. We've talked about the new assessments that have come online, all the pieces that came with that. And there's nothing in this budget to suggest that there's being deviation from those core tenets and core support that comes both from the legislature, the governor, and the State Board of Education in terms of those core pieces of what we do. But, as we talk about that, one thing that Governor Brown, having worked in his administration, I will say we knew this quite well, and I'm sure it got a lot of publicity. he really, oftentimes he was a deep skeptic when it came to data. And we talked about here, gather data, he would say, I really am not looking to invest in new data systems. We saw CalTides, right? The governor made sure CalTides was taken down. CalPads instituted some new requirements that basically said you cannot expand CalPads. There was just no budget to do that. And ultimately really said, look, we'll gather as much data as we minimally have to gather, but he was not a fan. Governor Newsom from very early on has said, no, I very much embrace data. And again, there's always nuance here, but said, look, I want a longitudinal data system. I want to build on what California has already developed and really try to create sort of a pre-K through career data system. And you see in this budget, there's $10 million to study what exactly that would look like. Hopefully, where Mike and I are talking about this, hopefully building on existing structures that we already have in place that would provide some infrastructure for this. But this is one place that we are sure to see some real differences moving forward. Right? There's going to be a real emphasis on this, building out a system and create linkages, not just in terms of funding, but also in the systems, data and otherwise, that connect all the systems together. I highlight just whole child focus. This is one of the things we've talked about too. It's not only just looking at our children in terms of everything from prenatal all the way up until a career in terms of their trajectory, but also looking at everything that supports a child beyond just kind of when they're in the classroom. So this is where we've seen more of an emphasis on and a focus on. I'm talking about community schools, wraparound services, everything from housing to nutrition, and really viewing this more holistically, both inside and outside of K-12. And so I think that would be a hallmark you'll see. This administration, you've certainly seen it in the budget. And it even comes out in very specific, tangible ways where they've signaled in this budget that among the indicators that we have now, and when we talk about K-12 schools, we're talking about things like our test scores, right? We're talking about chronic absenteeism, it's a newer one, right, that's come online. We've talked about high school graduation rates. Some of these indicators of success, we try to figure out who needs some additional support. They've signaled that they want to look at others around conditions of learning as possibilities. And then they want to take this and make sure that no matter where a child goes to school, as long as it's a California public school, including traditional schools, charter schools, and others, they want to apply similar requirements both on transparency and accountability across the board. That again, and that goes to the last bullet here, that's another shift. Right? Governor Brown was well noted for the fact that he tried to hold a pretty firm line about really trying to provide as much freedom for charter schools, and that also meant he vetoed a number of bills that tried to expand some of these transparency requirements that apply to traditional public schools to charters. Governor Newsom has said publicly on a number of occasions, including in conjunction with the budget release, he is looking forward to seeing a bill much like one that actually came up last term that deals with transparency issues with charter schools. And so we expect that will also be a place of some difference. And we don't know fully the parameters of that, but we know that that's going to be an area that will get a lot of discussion moving forward.
So, it may seem a little strange why I would focus on one simple little topic in the budget, but want to make sure, and this actually isn't in the state budget, this was dealt with last year, to make sure you're all on board with this, because this could have an influence on your own budgets going forward. So for the last several years, districts have had some flexibility around routine restrictive maintenance. So remember the provision for this account. This is if you participate in any way in the state's building program, then the state has a vested interest in you maintaining the buildings that they've given you some money to invest with, right? So there's a requirement that you set aside historically 3% of your general fund for this and set it in this separate category called routine restricted maintenance. Many of you fund your M&O trades with this money, so electricians, plumbers, carpenters, locksmiths, anything that does with a building system. You traditionally would not have funded custodians. They're not in the maintenance world, they're in the cleaning and custodial world. That doesn't have to do with repairing the building. Generally wouldn't have funded landscapes, grounds crews. You can now fund irrigation folks with this money because they recognize that irrigation systems, especially in a drought condition, is important to the state. And so we've had flexibility, first introduced during the Great Recession, and then continued even as we began to implement LCFF. The state was lobbied, advocates spoke to the need to not restore the routine, the 3%. During the Great Recession, you go down to 1%, and then once we came out of that, that was to sunshine or sunset. Get the one in it's either the east or the west, right? Was to sunset once LCFF came in place. But remember, LCFF was scheduled to be implemented over a period of time. And so the idea was that we would ease back in to the 3%. But that ends on July 1. And so if you are below 3% this year, you're at 2%, for example, you've got a whole percent to add back to your budget come July 1. Now, if you've accepted any Proposition 51 money, you've had to add that back this year. Or if you accept Proposition 51 money between now and June 30th, you will have to add it back this year. Okay? So probably a detail that many of you are not familiar with, but just go back home, and this will be a question if this comes up as your district presents its budget and has some impacts and all of that. Just know the history here, okay? The bottom line is the flexibility is in need, okay? The reason Prop 51, just so you know, is unique in this regard is this flexibility was reintroduced in June of 15, and Proposition 51's language says, when the voters approved it in November of 2016, the language said the state school facility program as we knew it on January 1 of 15. So if you accept Prop 51 money, the flexibility rules that were introduced 6 months later in June of 15 can't apply. Right, the legislature doesn't have the ability to change the rules when the rules were basically established in the proposition process, in the initiative process, proposition process. All right, additional facilities information for those of you with projects. So by mid-19, so it's great that the apportionments from Prop 51 are speeding up, but the bottom line is by mid-19 everything will have been exhausted and allocated, which will leave, I think the estimates, well, I don't know the estimate. There's like $4.5 billion of projects to process left out of the $7 billion, but it basically leaves the state without money. And so there's a number of bills out there, 4 specifically, that have already been introduced to begin to address this. The first one, AB 13, is $7 billion for higher ed, does not include K-12, specifically Hastings College of Law. Like, we need more attorneys. $2 billion for the CSU and $3 billion for construction of new CSU campuses. Okay, very specific in there. O'Donnell's AB 48 is a K-12 and community college, so this is the one that you'll have an interest in. School facilities bond on both the 2020 and the 2022. So we've done this in the past where we passed the legislation necessary for 2 different ballots in the even years, 2 years apart. There is no amount currently assigned to this. So the needs assessment of that, and then what politically, based on that needs assessment, what politically they believe they can swing will get assigned to each of those years. Kevin McCarty out of San Gramento has a $500 million preschool facilities bond in 2020. Kevin's a huge proponent of early childhood, as is the governor. And this focuses entirely on preschool. And then SB, Senate Bill 14, has a $4 billion higher ed, yeah, it's a typo. See, I even sent these to the attorney to proofread.
It was a number, so I just said, "Ow."
That's what happens when you type on the airplane. All right. It must have been one of those bumps last night. 2020 ballot. If it was 2010 ballot, we'd all be in trouble. Okay. With $2 billion for the UC, and again, more attorneys. Hastings College of Law. Oh wow, this I just was just. That's a 2. Hit the shift key at the wrong moment. Another bump in the clouds as I landed last night for the CSU. I apologize for that. I probably also didn't have my glasses on. So, all right. Here comes the controversial slides. Now, so know that my comments here, I want to put context around LA because it's just gonna float across the state, right? And by no means is this a negative. My comments are any way negative. I've been married for more years than I can count to a classroom teacher. And they call themselves the Red Shirt Movement, so I'm not labeling them that way. From a FICMAT perspective, we actually have no criticism of LA's collective bargaining agreement or Sac City's or Oakland's or anybody's. Our only point is that when you enter into agreements you can't afford, there's consequences to that, and therefore if you're going to enter into that kind of agreement, you have to make the second decision, which is what are you going to cut to be able to afford it. And that is where we care and we get concerned because our job's around fiscal stability. And so you have to eventually balance things out. So just understand the context here, but I think it's important for you to know kind of what's coming, and it's important probably to put some details around what you read in the media. So in LA we had the argument over teacher salaries, right? We had an argument over additional services for kids, specifically around nurses, librarians, and counselors. And we had an interesting collective bargaining topic around charter schools, which is not subject to collective bargaining. Of course, either is the amount of greenscape on a campus, which they bargained in LA, along with several other very interesting topics, right, which are typically not part of collective bargaining. So be prepared if you don't have a whole lot of greenscape. I noticed Mary Jane took her whole lawn out and eliminated green out there. So she may be subject to bargaining over the lack of green space. I'm just being silly, of course.
You had us really nervous because we thought you meant the other red shirting, which is parents holding their kindergartners.
Yeah.
No.
I was like,
And I don't mean NCAA red shirting or anything like that either, right? So this is about work stoppage or strikes, or obviously the goal here is to avoid a strike, right? It's about the movement we've seen come across the country. We've had it in West Virginia, we've had it in Kentucky, in Arizona, several places, and now certainly in the last couple weeks in LA. So I'm going to use some quotes right out of from a number of folks just to set context here, and I think it's important that you kind of understand this. The first, Alex was is UTLA's president, so the Teachers Association in Los Angeles. The LA strike was about the broader common good and not so much about the narrow working contract. And you all saw this in the media. They just absolutely beat the district to death because they could get their message across in just a couple words. Class sizes are too big. By the way, every one of their messages fits in 140 characters, right? We're all familiar with the limitations of Twitter. And so the district, to respond to class size issues, takes 5 or 6 pages of very complex explanation, right? It was a complex issue. If you look at the district as a whole, they were second to the lowest class size in the state, behind only San Francisco, which has the lowest class size in the state, and has all kinds of additional money that most other districts don't have. They have sales taxes, they have city-funded initiatives, all of those things in San Francisco that other districts don't have. And so, so the idea here was they sold this based on the services, the extra services to kids, none of which any of us would ever argue about, really. 40 years, Austin Buettner's the superintendent, 40 years of underinvestment in public education cannot be solved in just 1 week or with just one contract. And certainly there's truth to that. Charter schools, and SCNG is Southern California News Group, so owner of a whole, well, you've got one here in the north, the Northern California News Group, same company. Charter schools' role in the district played a significant factor in tensions between the teachers union and the school district. So LA Unified, which you'll still read, has some 700,000 kids, doesn't have 700,000 kids. They have 500 and some thousand kids, lost almost 200,000 kids over the last decade. Only about half of that goes to charter schools. The rest of it is natural changes in demographics, turnover of neighborhoods, those kinds of things where child's out of school, family stays behind, it's years later before family sells, and then a younger family moves back in, right? They're just in that, have been in that mode. From the head of the California Charter Schools Association, a charter school cap will do almost nothing to solve the district's financial problems. Independent experts, folks like me, I guess, who are, well, independent, I'm not sure expert's the right word, who are not beholden to the district, UTLA or charters, have stated clearly that LA Unified would be facing a fiscal crisis. There's tremendous, 100% true statement, okay? Easy way to deal with the lost 88 charters, I say easy, I know it's difficult, is you got to downsize the district. As you lose kids, you got to downsize your expenditures, right? Your revenue's not coming in at the same level anymore. You're not operating the same, you don't need to operate the same number of facilities, all those kinds of things, right? We have a district under state control near LA right now who has dropped from over 19,000 kids to less than 8,000 kids. You can't continue to operate all your schools and have the same infrastructure in place of staffing when you have that dramatic of a change, right? And so you have to downsize to adjust it. So understand where we're at here. Understand that this argument over 2 years, and my own opinion is this, no matter what the district had done over these 2 years, this strike was planned almost to the week, 2 years ago. Almost to the week. And everybody's known that. So truly, I think for the first time in years, and this is not a hit to anybody that used to be in LA Unified or anything, but the district had been, in this go-round, has been very, very transparent about their numbers. And they've had third-party folks come in and verify those numbers. While the union, the association may have challenged some of them, they were using the exact same numbers. They just put a little different spin on what the reserves made up of, and they were using the exact same numbers. And there'd been a lot of independent work done to validate those. So the district had been very candid about everything. So the consequence. The superintendent at the news release on that Tuesday morning, as the association, the mayor, and the superintendent get up and speak, says we've really never had an argument over salaries. We've really never had an argument over services to kids. We've only had an argument about how we're going to pay for the bill. And although we've just concluded a couple hours ago at 6 in the morning a contract, we still don't know how we're going to pay the bill. That's basically tremendous concerns over insolvency. And the superintendent says we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Now that makes folks like me really antsy, right? Because I got to deal with that. I got to figure out when that bridge is and all that. Well, I can tell you that bridge is in year 4. So we're in current year. Next year, the following year, it's the following year out. About a $1 billion negative fund balance. So not $1 billion of deficit spending. At that point, they've wiped out all their reserves. They're actually below zero at that point. So we'll have pretty dramatic deficit spending this year, next year, the following year, to the point that that $1.8 billion reserves, just as the district said it would be, will be completely eliminated. And they'll actually be below the zero line, okay? Now, the good news is, that's a ways out. So they got lots of time to correct this, right? Here's the bad news, or the pressure point. Year 4 becomes year 3 in June, when the LA Unified Board adopts their New Year's budget, right? The rolling years just move up a year, right? And the county office's job is to evaluate that budget based on all 3 years. It now shows up in that, which then puts the LA County Office of Ed, Mary Jane's colleague in LA, puts them in a position to disapprove LA's budget, okay? Which then sets in motion a whole bunch of other issues, all of which I have to deal with. The reason I picked Connie out here for a quote, I take a regular flight with Connie from Ontario to Sacramento multiple times a week, but she's the current chair, the new chair of Senate Education Committee. So understand her quote. She also, her former job before she was senator was a labor organizer, so you can put context around this. I'm so proud of the teachers for giving up their paychecks, walking the picket line, fighting for their students, and from what we've been told, really achieving most, if not all, of what they were asking for their students. Well, that's an interesting quote from somebody who now the district's asking for money. How do we solve our problem, right? The state needs to step up, right? It's back to the superintendent's quote that we have an underinvestment in education. The association says our numbers say it can be paid for, and the superintendent agreed to it. So they're not worried about it, right? So now we have to understand really what's going on here. I shared with you it's about $1 billion. Number one, the salary settlement is exactly what the district offered 8 months ago. Okay? The Friday night before the long weekend of negotiations, the parties' two proposals were $1.3 billion apart going into Friday. I calculated them all on Thursday. Salary was $500 million of that. Well, they agreed to the district salary, so the disagreement over salary, that $500 million was variance, if you will, was eliminated. So there's an to be precise, $811 million difference or cost associated to the added services, the nurses, the counselors, the class size reduction. Okay? The only thing different is not all $811 million has to be spent in the first year. It is an implementation over a 3-year period. But by the end of the 3rd year, again, we're back to our 3 years, right? The full amount would be realized. The full expenditure would be realized. It's also important to know that the district was spending supplemental and concentration on some of those services today. So for example, LA's really done this right. After their first year kind of messing up and being challenged on that, they have really treated their supplemental and concentration funds very, very appropriately. They don't call them supplemental concentration, they call them TSP, Targeted Student Population or Funding. And they allocate that money out based on a mechanism very similar to LCFF, but not exactly like it. It's a little bit more beefed up than the principles in LCFF. They allocate those funds out to school sites. There are 1,241 schools. And then they tell each school site, you kind of do your own little mini LCAP using your local stakeholder group. In addition, let's take nurses as an example. The district provided 1 day of nursing for every elementary school in the district out of their base funding. Some schools had 5 days, but they locally decided to spend their TSP or their supplemental concentration money on buying those additional 4 days, right? Which is why you heard the association say, this isn't going to cost a lot because you already have many of these services in place. The difference was local stakeholder groups made those decisions using supplemental and concentration. So we have this big dilemma now that if we're going to follow the principles of LCFF and LCAP, which is authentic stakeholder engagement in the decision-making process, we've kind of violated that principle in LA now by having one stakeholder group determine how it will all be spent. That's the teachers, and that's a perfectly fine stakeholder group, but it's not everybody, right? And not only will they determine it each year, that won't happen. They've determined it once and for all by embedding those formulas in their contract. Additionally, it treats all the schools the same. So a school in Woodland Hills, whose students may have very, very adequate health care services, are going to get 5 days of nursing. The same with a school in South Central LA or East LA or down in the Harbor area, whose community doesn't have the same level of health care available for all kids, right? And the way the district was doing it previously, it accounted for all that. So now there's uniformity to all this. So while they may have a bottom line $1 billion problem, I'm going to say I think they have a $2 billion problem, and that's because the money that they've taken now that was supplemental concentration to pay this bill, I think still has to be allocated out to the school sites, because the state, if it's going to hold to its principles around LCFF, is going to say embedding those things into the contract is not acceptable. And we've already seen the first shot across the bow where Brooks' old buddies at the ACLU and public advocates have already filed their letter warning the district of the concern. And I was just going to say, and the county superintendent, in a very well-written letter, I do say so myself, basically that laid out their comments and observations on the agreement through the public disclosure process before the board took their vote on Tuesday, last Tuesday. Also laid this out by saying it would appear that you're going to spend your money different than what your LCAP says, so be sure and update your LCAP and resubmit it to us for consideration, right? And so the district is in not really uncharted territory by any means, but they have put themselves squarely here to end a 6-day strike. Now, one of the things, just so you guys all know too, a little detail that's not talked about, the district did not agree, and I'm not sure UTLA asked for it. I can't imagine though they left the table without at least asking, but I don't know this was certain that they asked. They did not add work days to the end of the year. Not school days, because they were open, but work days to the end of the year so the teachers could make up their lost pay. And just so you all understand how this works, all those teachers for a lifetime now have lost 6 days of STIRS. So they in essence have a partial work year, not a full work year of service credit this year. So their 6 days of pay, the raise they got will about make up for the 6 days of pay that they've lost. And so back to Alex's comment here about the broader good, that is clearly what they were arguing about in some sense. But we've got obviously some consequences to what's been agreed to. So where do we go from here? Well, the movement is on the move. So we spent Thursday and Friday in fact-finding in Oakland, ended Friday at 5 o'clock without an agreement. But as I'm told, I wasn't there, on a positive note. However, an hour or so ago, they came out with an announcement, I assume, that they authorized a strike, right? We haven't heard. That's what was scheduled to come out at 4:30. So maybe they came out and said, hey, we got a deal, we're thrilled. But I'm guessing that's not what the news conference was about. Sacramento is cash insolvent in November, so that term is the technical term for a state takeover of that district, or now under new rules will no longer be the state that takes them over, it'll be the county office that takes them over. They have a court hearing either later this week or next week over a disagreement of contract terms. They actually have a current contract, doesn't expire till June, but they're in a dispute over contract terms. And the district, instead of going through the arbitration process, has actually taken the teachers to court in order to speed up resolution of the dispute. And that's because the district, if they don't take pretty evasive corrective action here in the next couple weeks, they will not be able to avoid November insolvency. November seems a long ways away, but the reality is any decisions they make right now really don't go into effect till July 1, and if they don't make some big decisions by March 15th, they simply won't be able to avoid that. And so understand these are the next two places you're going to hear. So in Oakland, I can tell you that the exact same language and arguments we saw in LA, the exact same words in the same sentence structure are used in Oakland. They will be eventually used in Sacramento.
Question like 95%.
95% vote for strike. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. I certainly expected that. Now Oakland, I spend a day a week in Oakland. My team spends more time there than I do. It's a district that's also on the verge of insolvency again, struggling a lot. Again, I'm going to say that doesn't mean they shouldn't enter into a good contract. That may be the right thing to do for their instructional program and their employees. They just got to figure out how to pay for it. And so just understand kind of where things are headed. It's kind of all around you some form or another. Oakland is another district that is heavily impacted by charters. Again, they are a district though that has embraced the charter movement very significantly. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to adjust to it. It's like a collective bargaining agreement. If you're going to agree to certain terms, then you just have to live with those. If you're going to have charters, you live with the consequences of that. We're in Vallejo, just across the bay. Also a district like Oakland that formerly was taken over by the state. In their case, they had about a $10 million deficit. Former superintendent that the board fired went out and tried to start a charter school. The board turned it down, appealed to the county office, whose board approved the charter on appeal. And they now have a $22 million deficit because it's not a small charter school. It's about 700 and some kids. So overnight, out of the district's control, right, they've lost 700 and some kids, and it just skyrockets their deficit, right? They've got a lot of cuts to make. So, again, don't have an opinion about that charter. I couldn't even tell you the name of that charter, but you just have to deal with the consequences. So, speaking of fiscal health, give you a quick view of what the state looks like. Remember when you all adopt your budgets in June, you submit those to Mary Jane, to Kate, previously to Tarina, but everything's going great, right? Because she's not in the county office right now. No, I'm just kidding. Across the state of 1,100 school districts, there were 6 disapproved. A year ago, there were 2 disapproved. Of the 6, all but 1 have been resolved. Okay, not necessarily all in good ways, but they've been resolved. 1 remains as a disapproved budget. At first interim, so December, there were 39 self-certified qualified. Okay, that's down from a year ago of 42, but up from second interim last spring of 25. Okay, there have been 3 whose positive certifications by the district board have been not accepted by the county, and they've been what we call downgraded. And so that brings us back to the 41, real close to last year's 42. Those 3, anytime a county superintendent, which happens rarely, you see 3 out of the whole state, is a rare occurrence, to be honest. But those go on a separate list for folks like me, because what gets called into question immediately is that the district isn't recognizing itself where it's at, right? It's not being truthful with itself, and the county has had to step in and change the certification. Whether that kicks off intervention by the county or by somebody like us is a different question. It's just you certified positive, and there's absolutely nothing about this interim that justifies positive, right? There are 4 self-certified negative: Sac City, Sweetwater Union High School District in San Diego County, Southern Kern, a little tiny district in Kern County, and Feather Falls Union Elementary in Butte County. So what absolutely works here in the 27 years that we've had AB 1200 is that the process, the oversight process and so on absolutely works. With the exception of Feather Falls, and I'll explain them in a second, districts that are on the negative list generally are only there once. The system of support comes around them, and at their next interim, they're off the negative list. Okay? And that consistently happens time and time again. Tell the legislature this on a regular basis. Yes, there's 4 negatives. It happens to be the exact same number as last year. But 3 of the 4 districts are different districts. The right amount of intervention by the county and by others was provided to 3 of these, and they've moved on and they've improved. Feather Falls is unique, little tiny single school district with 10 kids, K-8. 5 of the 10 kids are in 8th grade. They've been on the negative list for multiple years. And that's because we've been waiting for those 5 to get to 8th grade, because they promote out of the district, and the district will be left with 5 kids, at which point a neighboring district will take over service of those 5 and provide instruction for those 5 kids. Yes, not at their neighborhood school. The school will close. But that's been the plan. So there's been no planned state intervention. County is helping them pay some of their bills as they have kind of struggled through this. In the case of Sac City, they were also one of the disapproved budgets. Sweetwater, one of the disapproved budgets. Southern Kern was not one of the disapproved budgets. A little different circumstances in each case. Sac City, you've read a lot about, it's been in the media a lot. They did over a year ago enter into a collective bargaining agreement that they could not afford. County's been clear with them from day one, multiple times, standing at the podium talking to the district about the need to make adjustments now. Not in the collective bargaining agreement, but in their operations. They've allowed a whole year to go by with making no adjustments. I spoke to him in December in a board meeting and said, you've got to start your adjustments tomorrow. Your back's up against the wall, right? We're now in February, they've made no adjustments. And so they are, I already shared with you, we've already forecasted out when they'll be out of cash, which is what cash insolvency means. You're out of cash, not a budget issue at that point. You just simply don't even have enough cash to meet your payroll and to honor your paychecks. Sweetwater was not on anybody's radar screen until the end of August. They closed their books, and instead of their estimated positive $15 million fund balance, they had a negative $15 million fund balance. And the reasons for that negative, in last year's, they carried over into this year's budget. So immediately this year, they're starting the year with a negative 15, plus they have all the problems that caused that built into their budget, which also resulted from a collective bargaining agreement that they ultimately didn't properly address. So again, it didn't result from the agreement, it really resulted from their failure to address the conditions around the agreement. And they have that $30 million in the current year, jumps to some $40 million next year. There's all kinds of issues at this point in Sweetwater. Let me share with you, probably since most of you I think are school board members, let me share with you a critical piece in Sweetwater. And I've told them this. They have not accepted they have a problem. They are all smiles and everything's hunky-dory. That's a technical budget term. I have shared with them, as I share with folks regularly, it really doesn't matter which 12-step process you follow. It also doesn't matter whether you're there for alcohol or drugs or relationships or an upside-down budget. Step one is always the same. We can't get to step two until we get through step one, and step one is we have to admit we have a problem. I can't get them to admit they have a problem yet, despite being beyond candid in my comments. I mean, to the point that probably I was a little over the line in laying it out for them. But I can't help them until we get to step two, right? Then we can help them solve their problem. We, being a big collective, we can help them solve their problem. I just can't get them to admit that they have a problem. And yet they have a current year problem. Not an LA problem that's right now in year 4. They have a current year problem. And for all intents and purposes, they would appear to me right now to already be cash insolvent. They're just borrowing from some other funds, some of which are questionable borrowing to start with. And so understand, there's some pretty severe things going on out there. One lack of going concern, this is 42-127.6 of the Ed Code. This is where it's very similar to a negative certification, but the county sup can take a district to lack of going concern at any time during the year, not just the interim budget reviews. Is Albert Unified in Riverside County. They don't have a problem of not acknowledging they have a problem. They're working on it, and they're working hard at it. I've had different teams there now for almost 3 months running. They are working away at it. I just hope they can get there. So graphically, I'm pointing in obviously the wrong direction. I don't even know where the computer's at that I'm pointing at. I assume it's over in that corner, but who knows, out in the cloud somewhere. So graphically, this is negative qualified and qualified and negative certifications at interims or reports. The yellow is qualified. The green is that 39 I just reviewed with you from December. It's self-certified, so it hasn't been through its full process of county when we put this chart together and then ultimately state review. The reddish orange are negative. And one of the things you see here is that qualified flows with the ebb and flow of the state economy and the state budget. Negatives are fairly consistent irrespective of what the economy is. Yes, there's a little bit of a bump when things get rough, right? But for the most part, they're pretty consistent. What goes into a negative certification is far more than a few budget issues, right? In the 9 districts and 1 community college that have failed in the last 27 years and needed a state bailout, we can tell you with absolute assurity that ultimately they were a governance and leadership issue, and generally speaking, that started years earlier, 10 years, 15 years. Inglewood goes back almost 15 years. It was once a thriving, great place for kids. It took a long time before it ultimately manifests itself in a fiscal issue where they ran out of cash. Okay? But it ultimately gets back to governance and leadership with respect to the district. And so you get some sense of kind of how things are out there. And so on that note, to conclude, you all know this, but it's ultimately the governance team's responsibility to ensure your district is fiscally sound. It's not Mary Jane's at the county soup. It's not mine in FCMAT. It's not somebody in Sacramento, another agency, Department of Finance, or the controller, or CDE, or somebody. The preparation, the approval, the monitoring, the reporting of your budgetary and your financial data ultimately rests with the governance team that's represented here. The county superintendent does have oversight responsibilities in that process to monitor your fiscal condition. For charter schools, that oversight process rests with the authorizer. And for county offices, such as Mary Jane, that oversight rests with the state superintendent's office. So, FCMAT looks at, I didn't mean to do that. FCMAT looks at 20 areas, and I include this because I think it's important as you look at your budgets and your interim reports, you can narrow down on some things to focus on. That helps you have a higher level of confidence, if you will, in your own data and your own numbers and where you're headed as a district. We have 20 areas that we look at that we call indicators of fiscal distress and potential insolvency in a school district. The majority of the 20 we consider to be high risk. We put these in 3 categories: high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And so some of these will make perfect sense to you. Budget development and adoption is a high risk area. Monitoring is a high-risk area. Cash management is a high-risk area. You all remember what happened during the Great Recession and the deferrals from the state, right? Deficit spending. Enrollment and attendance. This right here drives our expenditures, but it also drives our revenue, right? When we're not monitoring that, it puts us at great exposure. Information systems and data management. Quality systems. Quality data management is essential, and I'm not only talking about data, fiscal data, but enrollment, demographic data, all of that drives your revenue now. So Census Day, that first week of October, that first Wednesday of October, is what determines your enrollment that you report to the state and your demographic profile as a district, which influences what you're going to get in LCFF by way of dollars and cents. Multi-year projections, cannot say enough about this area. It is, in my opinion, one of the most important documents when your staff brings you that big, thick thing of what we call SACS reports that's in your board agenda that you approve. That means, unless you're an expert in this, almost tells you nothing. You need to find the form MYP. You need to find the form cash. And you need to find the first 2 pages of Form 01, which is the general fund summary of the budget. Those are the 3, of all those pages, those are the 3 things that you should be pulling out and asking a lot of questions about. Position control, 85% of what we spend in our district, some higher, a few lower, are people, some people. We have these great systems that control how many number 2 yellow pencils with and without erasers we can buy. Right? Requisition, a purchase order. We have to jump through all these hoops to get that little box of pencils, or for a teacher to get that box of pencils. And then we don't invest in good position control systems. And yet one governs literally a penny of what we spend, and the other governs 85 cents of every dollar we spend. And then I'm going to come back to what I said earlier one of the areas of high risk is leadership and stability. And this is a problem, we were just talking about it. It's a problem when our superintendents, average tenure of our superintendents are 2.5 years, right? Across the state. Because we start over every 2.5 years when we don't get the stability we need. Stability is absolutely critical to fiscal stability. Medium risk, you might think special ed should be high risk, but we think it's actually easier to control special ed than we give it credit for when done right. But ultimately, when we're talking about insolvency, it's a medium risk, not a high risk. Now, there are some high risk elements in special ed, but as a topic as a whole, we categorize it as a medium risk. And then low risk would be annual independent audit. For any CPAs in the room, you may disagree with that too, but again, we're focused on a particular thing, and that is if they point out material findings, do you have the capacity to incorporate the corrections of those material findings without going broke? Charter schools and certainly facilities. So give you a sense of things you can focus on to kind of assess your own risk. This is a tool, by the way, that's on our webpage. You can download it. There are 140 yes or no questions spread across these 20 areas. And it's a golf game. The lowest score wins. High risk cutoff is about 40. So it doesn't take too many high-risk questions in a high-risk area to get to 40. But you can go through that tool yourself. If you really want to do it as a district, I would recommend that you plan a year or so to do it. And you just take one of each 20 area at a meeting, at a board meeting, if you want to publicly go through it. I'm not sure that's the best option for you, but and you answer the questions, yes or no. There's no maybe answers, pure yes or no. You got to be honest about the answers. You can also have folks like us come in, although we have no time, come in to do it. So with that, happy to answer. I know Brooks is happy to answer any questions, especially is transitional kindergarten mandated or not?
Okay, who has any questions?
There's no way.
Okay, what is the answer? Is transitional kindergarten mandated? Let's go for it.
To offer it or to attend it?
To provide it.
To provide it.
So the Department of Education has a declarative frequently asked question on their website where this comes up with great frequency, and they unequivocally say all districts are required to provide transitional kindergarten regardless of status. That's the position of the State Department of Ed. There are others who will offer opinions about whether it's based on whether you want to accept the apportionment or not. I will say that is a question that clearly the Department of Ed, who's giving you your money, takes one position, and if you get a position with others, you should consult your counsel.
Which means writing a check to an attorney.
Not necessarily. You could have general counsel, you could be on retainer.
Way back in the beginning, you said in 1978, the federal government said they would support 40% of the sped.
She said that.
I
That's all of
Yeah.
it.
And now they only support 8.
A back
Where's the
proxy.
fight? Where's the lawsuits? Why aren't we getting more?
There have been,
One lawyer.
yeah. Well, I'll just say this,
I'll have it.
as a special educator, it's one of those things that doesn't necessarily get the traction that we need it to. People, that's all set, people want to make their mark in different areas, and that's just sort of left to the side. But it is an area that I think, if we look in our community, $20 million or so excess related to the STRS and PERS these last years. And our community doesn't want to pay for people's retirement, but they would understand some of these issues, I think, around special education. We do have Jared Huffman, who represents us, right, in Washington, who is very public about the fact that he has a kid with special needs who's been served by our programs. Our governor is very proud of the fact that he's dyslexic. And so I feel like we're at a certain time, right, that maybe people who would have more acknowledgement of if indeed kids get what they need, we save money, but in order to make sure they get what they need, we actually need the resource. So, do you have any thoughts about how we can fix that?
I'll only say, and this, my guess is, and other people in the room may have gone, and every year there is a group of Californians who go back. We have district representatives, we have state representatives, governor's office representatives, Department of Ed, go back and meet with the congressional delegation for California to talk about this specific issue every single year. They're related issues, but this is really oftentimes at the core of it, talking about this imbalance between what was expressed as the intent, right, where they were going to go, and then what actually provided. I've gone on 2 of those for 2 different years. I was part of those. Never have I ever seen a negative reaction when you have the meeting with a member or anyone else. Of course, absolutely, we understand it's a bipartisan issue. Senator Bob Dole was a great advocate and pushed, and you meet with the membership on both sides of the aisle, and everybody, yes, we understand, it's absolutely. That does not translate into a significant increase in funding. Part of that, I mean, there's a broader debate about how much money the federal government just provides for education overall. Right? It really depends on the dollar. And so you talk about this, and you talk about what it would mean to really meet that gap. I mean, certainly California would be the largest recipient across the country, but when you talk about that as a national dollar amount, what would be required? So it's this is where it just becomes my own take on it, just from what I've seen. It's not a question of support; it's a question of priority. Everyone will say absolutely, we wouldn't fight that. I mean, there's not many people who would die. But when you take those federal dollars and then a process where that's chosen against a bunch of other priorities, that just simply hasn't risen to the top of the agenda for leadership on either side of that.
It was in Bush's years, we got closer to 13%, and it slid back down. Remember the context here. So the feds generally are out of the education business, right? That's a state, an excluded right in the Constitution, left to the states. They get involved because they set some kind of requirement. So in the case of what we're talking about here, it's the IDEA legislation from '74, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Education Improvement Act.
Right, thank you, yeah. That's right. And so because they set some requirements, that's where the funding commitment then comes from, just like Title I, right? They set a requirement, if you're going to take the money, they'll give it to you, but you have to meet certain criteria, right? You don't have to accept it. So.
Nancy?
So, the governor has, in his new budget, put away the $3 billion in pay down of that, and you noted the biggest thing maybe is the acknowledgement at the state level, potentially. When we meet with our state legislators, what would you recommend are the items that they really need to understand better from us as educators that we can hit home? We've been hitting them with, the PERS and STIRS every year, and it's, sometimes it goes somewhere, sometimes. But where are you hearing? Well, where do you think that they need?
So I would continue that narrative. Yeah. I would be very thoughtful about what data you give them. So get this down to something everybody can understand, and that's a per student cost, per ADA, whatever metric you're going to use. The PERS increase is so much per kid. The STIRS increase is so much per kid. The COLA is so much per kid. And just lay it out in very simple math. Does the COLA increase cover the PERS increase and the STIRS increase and the increased discrepancy in special ed versus revenue versus cost, and anything else you may have? Because what I think enhances your story and your narrative is, despite a very healthy COLA, you're actually taking a step backwards, right? Your ability to sustain the programs we have invested in, have our community buy-in through the LCAP process, all of that, and we haven't even addressed yet compensation and health benefits. And one of the other factors I would definitely put in is your step and column cost, because that's a contractual commitment whether you increase salaries or not, right? So step and column, PERS, STIRS, and a thoughtful calculation around special ed. I bet if you line those up on a per kid basis compared to the per dollar, the COLA per student, you're going to have a discrepancy there, and you're going to be upside down. I think that very, very simple starts to drive this home. They are certainly well aware. Remember, the same PERS increases the state's paying. They are the largest employer in PERS. They understand the impact on their budget, right? They get that. But I think when it comes to something, especially if you're talking to a legislator that cares about, truly cares about K-12, K-14, however you want to describe it, right? Because they're together in this. Then that helps with that narrative, I think. Explain the impact locally.
And the only thing I just want to add to that real quick is when you have these conversations, you have to be, for these folks who are hearing you, right, have been in those shoes, they're hearing from everybody all day about all the rules, right? And so if you go in with a list of a dozen and certain person is one of them, it's just not going to make that much of an impact. If you go in with one or two, one or one, that might make an impact. Because, and make it really tangible, like Mike said, but it's, there is a really deep awareness of the consequences, but ultimately, they have to solve the problem, right? And this is a question of competing, it's just, it almost goes back, it's competing priorities, right? I mean, it's typically for most of those folks, they'll go back and say, absolutely we want to do this, but we also need to make sure that everything gets health care, right? And so what are our trade-offs here? Well, we really think it's critical that we have all of these 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds in the state who don't have access to early childhood education. Do we do that, or do we make like what feels like a, dropping a pebble in an ocean impact on STIRS and STIRS when we need to go back to tell you later what are we doing, and we say, hey, we got the rate down by 0.02, or what I did is I made sure 100,000 kids got preschool they didn't get. Which ones got more credit voters? And so just thinking from their perspective, when you go in, how can you frame it in those terms that they will be able to feel they can turn around and report back to you, here's what I did in a way that feels meaningful, given the dollars they really have to work with.
If you're supportive of the governor's proposal to put some one-time non-Prop 98 money into it, I would certainly express that. Because I can tell you that ledge staff has heartburn over that proposal. Ledge staff has a lot of heartburn over the proposal because it crosses the non-98 and the 98 side. I'm not at all convinced legislators themselves have that much heartburn over it. So reinforcing that with them as opposed to their staff is an important message. The other thing is, remember, it's one-time money. And it's actually a pretty good use of one-time money. Putting one-time money in additional preschool slots works for 1 year. Then you're left with a hole, right? Putting money here, assuming STIRS can actually do something with it, you're leveraging that one-time money into recurring savings.
So I have a question about the quality of education, what our educational programs are across the state. From 08 on, districts cut programs, science, rolled back, art, music, PE, all the things that support the quality reading and math that is provided. And with the retirement costs that we haven't been able to build those back in. My question is, we have a pretty good idea what's happening in Marin. We see that we're having to make cuts. But what are you seeing in the rest of California? Is this across the board that we are losing what we offer as an educational program to our children compared to other states? Because other states are able, you go in and see what we're 41st, right? That's what I've been told. I don't know what you...
Per student
per student, I don't
expenditure.
know what the number... But if you look at what New York and some of the other states are offering, it's a sad
Different
state.
tax systems, right? As
Right.
you vary from the states. That's number one. You have to understand those differences. The simple answer to your original question, though, is yes, that's a very common thing that you see from community to community. Each community responds a little differently to that. Each community has different ability to help mitigate that. So in the north, even in this county, parcel taxes are somewhat popular, right? At least to introduce them. They may not be always popular by the taxpayer. In the south, parcel taxes are almost unheard of, which is interesting. LA is talking about a parcel tax. LA's talking about the impact of the split roll initiative on the 2020 ballot to undo the commercial, to change the rules from Prop 13 as it relates to commercial property. And they see that as one of their savings, you know, graces. I get it. It's a few $1 billion statewide. So each community is a little different in its ability to adjust to those, but those same themes of art, music, the time spent on science, the time spent on even social sciences, right? Talk to your teachers. They will give you an earful about the balance between ELA, math, science, social science, and some of the other things, right? Now, some of that we've done by way of policy, or you've done in a board role by way of policy. Some of it's done by state policy with regard to more emphasis on 2 subjects, right? That alone sets the stage for a little bit of imbalance. We would, as educators, all argue that you can teach English and you can teach math in those other subjects, and sometimes far more authentically, and far more with an affinity for the student to understand, you know, to make a connection and understand the practical application of it. So each district's a little different in their focus there, but remember, we test. You don't get me started on the test. We test on 2 subjects, right? I really already said too much.
Yeah, I did have a question on the special education funding.
You're not going to get any, so don't bother asking.
Yeah. Well, that's what I figured. What I had read from it was that it is indeed intended to go to those districts that have high concentrations of high needs students. So if that's the case, then in Marin County, there's Sandra Fell Elementary, there's Shoreline, there's Sausalito Marin City, and there's Laguna Joint School District that have a high concentration of high needs students.
So Kate, I want to make sure, knowing that I haven't read this thoroughly yet.
Yeah, and I haven't gotten into the
but,
details, and I'm not sure
I don't think, although I use the word concentration, the language refers to the unduplicated count, not concentration, at least. Well, I'm sorry, you got to separate the pool. You got to separate the 2 buckets of money. The ongoing piece refers to unduplicated counts. The one-time piece, 186 million, refers to concentration. Yeah, special ed concentration grant for each local agency. So
either way, it appears
every
to be
school
tied to
district,
number
every
of
school
high
district has
needs
some
students.
element of unduplicated, right? But there's no doubt the higher that percentage is, that the more of these funds will go there.
Thank you.
Well, under this proposal.
Yeah, and exactly, it
Right.
is just.
And if they followed O'Donnell's 3622 last year, I can't remember the bill number, something like that. I think I have the numbers right there in the wrong order, which is a frequent problem for me. If you followed that and how the funds would be allocated out, that would be a very different mix for some of your school
I wanted to highlight quickly on that. I just think overall, like in terms of providing context for that funding, part of this is in recognition of what folks have known, but then also what came out for the California School Dashboard. So you look at the number of local educational agencies that have been identified as needing support, and you look at the student groups that help drive that identification. Students with disabilities drove a lot of that. That drove some investments last year. It drove this creation of kind of the state system of support to get your content leads and you get your systems leads. Dollars came about as an effort to try to address that. These are dollars, again, going to Mike's point about, hey, how can you use some one-time dollars to try to help address these challenges? The Department of Ed got multiple positions in their special ed department proposed as part of this budget to also help capacity in conjunction with some of the regional supports to do this. So it's all part of a broader recognition or an attempt to recognize through the state budget process the needs of students with disabilities and provide a greater network of supports and some dollars to do that. And Mike and Kate's point, the details of how this gets played out are going to be played out. There might be more dollars ultimately played in this. The formula may change. but all of it's in that framework, the debate's going to take place.
Well said. Kate, you'll remember this, while others in the room, this is a technical detail, but you and Tarina would certainly remember this. The very first year and what LA did with supplemental concentration, they reduced their special ed contribution.
Yes.
Over much of this, that formula that I'm reading right here is probably not a whole lot different than what LA applied that very first year and then got challenged legally, right? And they reversed it. And since that point, they've been doing it really well, which is what I described to you earlier. Allocate the money out to school sites, they decide. But in the first year, they said our special ed contribution is X billions. If I remember the number right, they put 450 million of.
Right, they basically just tried to look, what's our students' disabilities population? How many of them
How many of them are also
unduplicated?
unduplicated? This formula looks very, very similar to that approach.
Any other questions?
One more quick one.
Yes,
Do you think that Prop 13 will be on the 2020 ballot?
It already is qualified. The split roll initiative.
yes.
Well, project that, that's gonna be healthy.
It's only like
we have the
11
numbers.
billion statewide, and for the K-12 system, I think it's like 4 to 5 billion. And so, and then it's gonna come down to locally, what will that actually mean? We haven't done the analysis, but let's put it this way. Any and everything helps, and in meetings that we've been in, what we're hearing is that there's some negotiations going on right now, right, about that essential proposition, along with some other things that others are talking about, and that really, gets to the adequacy. But we've got we have a long way to go, and just to put a number back to your comment about describe what it means to a kid. So the example I gave you for special ed is $155 per kid in Marin County that's not funded. So that's an example, just one example. Any other last minute comments? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, Brookside.